that they bear some relationship to one another, but it's going to take me a while to get to the connection. So I try to hang in there through inconsequentialities, because the first thing I've been thinking about does seem perhaps inconsequential. I suspect that most of you are unaware of my wife Susie's amazing ability to be a walking encyclopedia of popular music for the past 50 years. Her ability to name the song, the group, and the year it came out for almost any song I can hum to her was one of the distracting wiles she used to capture my heart. And since I frequently find music in my head that is familiar to me, but which I cannot remember, we often have an interaction, a conversation that goes something like, "What's this song? Da, 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 da." To which she responds, "That's On and On by Stephen Bishop. It came out in 1977. And she's pretty much always right, except when I can't remember the words correctly, or I can't remember any of the words, or I get the tune wrong. And even despite those obstacles, she's right a lot of the time. We had a breakdown a couple weeks ago over the song Baker Street by Jerry Rafferty. I could remember the melody for a portion of the verse, and I could remember the saxophone solo, but I couldn't remember any of the words. And based on my humming of the verse, she thought it was a song to which it does in fact bear similarities, but which it turned out not to be. And then I kept saying to her, "But the saxophone solo," and I would go, "Da, da, 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 da," and brought absolutely nothing to her mind. And when we finally figured out what song it was, and we played it, and the sax solo came up, I said, "See, there it is. How could you not know that saxophone solo?" And she said, "That's not what you were singing." And I said, "Yes, it is." And I did my da, 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 da for her again. And she said, "Yes, those are the notes, but you don't have any of the swing or the rhythm. You made it sound like a march by Sousa. I was trying to remember a march." So this is how we often spend our drives together to and from work. And for some reason, this past week, she started some nonverbal singing of the song written by Pete Seeger and most famously recorded by the Byrds, based on Ecclesiastes. Turn, turn, turn. To everything, turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 etc. This is a song I know extremely well. I practically imbibed it with my mother's milk. But I could not believe what I was hearing when she started singing. I said, "What are you doing? That's not how it goes." "Yes, it is," she said. "That's exactly how it goes." "No, it isn't," I argued. "It goes like this." And I did my vocalization. "No, it doesn't," she said. "You're just crazy." Well, there was a way to solve this, and driving there on the way to work, we pulled up Apple Music on the radio and asked it to play the Byrds version of Turn, Turn, Turn. And there, to my complete and utter amazement, was the tune that she had been singing. It was the high harmony part, and I had never heard it before, because I heard Turn, Turn, Turn from Pete Seeger before I heard it from the Byrds. I always focused on the melody line and the words, and I had literally never heard any of the other notes or voices in that song. And Susie, for her part, conceded that I had been singing the melody line, but she said, was singing the really beautiful part. So it was interesting that we had this whole interaction during the week that the Friends United Meeting General Board was having their meeting. Friends United meeting is composed of the members of 36 yearly meetings and a handful of independent monthly meetings. And that sounds like a huge number, and it is, but the number of yearly meetings and associations and individual meetings in North America is much, much smaller, about a dozen. And yet those dozen yearly meetings cover a vast theological and political spectrum and are often in conflict with one another. Because of those conflicts, Indiana Yearly Meeting, which has always been a supporting pillar of the work of Friends United Meeting, decided this summer to withdraw from membership. This was probably the final step of the redefinition of Indiana yearly meeting that began with their split about 10 years ago. And even though Indiana's dissatisfaction with Friends United meeting reaches back at least 30 years, and their withdrawal was not unexpected, it still produced sadness and shock, especially on the part of the FUM board. So it was the spoken and unspoken subtext of all that went on in these board meetings over the past 4 days. And what I heard board members from the evangelical and the liberal and the middle of the road parts of the FUM spectrum all say over and over again was, it can be really difficult, really hard to work together because we are so different. But we absolutely need to listen to those different ways of seeing and being in order to grasp God's larger picture. We not only have to wrestle with our stereotypes in order to see the real persons who are not stereotypes, but complex and contradictory creations of God who are sitting on either side of us at these board meetings, but we need to listen to their different priorities and their different ways of seeing to actually know God's path for all of the world. Now set that thought aside for a little bit. In the book of 2 Samuel in the Hebrew scriptures, there is a really horrifying story about King David, a married woman he either rapes or seduces named Bathsheba, and her husband Uriah the Hittite, one of David's loyal soldiers. This is in 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. And so David is at home in Jerusalem. He is conducting a war against the Ammonites, but his general is setting siege to the city. David is at home. He goes out on the rooftop. He sees a beautiful woman bathing. He becomes obsessed with her. He asks people who she is. He sends for her. He sleeps with her. And a while later, she sends him a note saying she's become pregnant. She happens to be the wife of Uriah the Hittite, who is the servant to his general. And in order to try to make it look as though he has not slept with her, David sends to his general and says, send Uriah back home. So Uriah comes home. He comes immediately to see King David. David says, go home, you lucky dog. You've been here a long time. I'm sure that you want to see your wife. But David comes out the next morning and discovers that Uriah has not gone home. And when he asks him why not, he says, well, I'm a soldier and there are other soldiers who are on the front and they are away from their families and they are camping out in the wild. And I don't feel as though I can go home to my wife in my soft bed when they are suffering. So David says, okay, well, why don't you come have dinner with me tonight? And he throws a banquet and he gets Uriah as drunk as he can possibly make him. And then he says, now go home and see your wife. And he comes out the next morning and discovers that Uriah has not gone home to his wife. He still refuses to sleep in his own warm, soft bed with his wife when other soldiers are suffering at the front. So David said, you're a good, loyal soldier to me. I'm so proud to have you. Please take this note to the general when you go back. And inside the note is an instruction to the general to attack the walls and then withdraw so that Uriah will be killed. And that is what happens. Uriah takes this note to the front. The general attacks the walls and withdraws. Uriah is struck down by an arrow. David waits through the period of mourning, and then he marries Bathsheba, who is pregnant, and eventually the baby is born, but is sickly. And before the baby can be circumcised and named, which is what would happen on the 8th day, David is confronted by the prophet Nathan. And I'm going to read this account from the Book of God by Walter Wangerin. As I said, you can read this story of David in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, but if you really want to get the full horror of this story, try reading it in the Book of God, in which what David has done to everyone around him is just appalling. Anyway, this is what Walter Wangerin writes. Late in the winter, during the latter rains, when almond trees bloomed white in the streets of Jerusalem, Bathsheba gave birth to a son. She never named the child. David thought to name him, for the baby was alabaster, fragile, translucent, and his father's heart was moved by the pale beauty and the weakness of the tiny boy. But David was interrupted. A prophet named Nathan requested an audience, saying he could not wait till the child was circumcised. The matter wanted an immediate judgment. Sir, said Nathan, 2 men have a dispute. The one is rich, with many flocks and herds. The other is so poor that he had but one little ewe lamb, which he brought up with his children. She used to eat from his table, as dear as a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man. The rich man was unwilling to give up any of his own sheep, so he seized the poor man's lamb and slaughtered her and cooked her for his visitor's food. When David heard the nature of the dispute and the injustice done to someone so powerless, he was outraged. As the Lord lives, he said, anyone who can do such a thing deserves to die. Is that, said Nathan, the king's judgment? David said, surely the rich man must restore to the poor man 4 times what he took. Nathan said, how does one restore a life? David looked at the prophet with exasperation. Even a rich man can't make the dead to live again. Exactly, Nathan said. He took a stand immediately before the king and said, David, you are that man. As for the poor man, thus says the Lord, I delivered you from Saul. I gave you the houses of Judah and of Israel. I gave you wives, and if that were too little, I would add as much more. Why then have you despised the word of the Lord? Why have you slain Uriah the Hittite with the weapons of the Ammonites, and then taken his wife to be your wife? David took hold of the throat of his garment and began to tear it slowly from top to bottom. His face had gone haggard with grief. I have sinned, he whispered, staring at Nathan, his thin chest appearing where his royal robe had been. I have sinned against the God of Israel. Sometimes when it comes to our differences, we have to listen and see better. We have to liberate others from our preconceptions and our laziness and our unwillingness to engage. We have to look with a more loving eye and heart. But sometimes our differences are not about ways of thinking, but about resources, about sheep and about water and about land and about olive trees. And sometimes conflicts need justice before they need conflict resolution. Sometimes we need a political solution before we can have any kind of peaceful solution. There is violence, abhorrent violence on both sides of this war in Israel. And as people of peace, we cannot say that any kind of violence is more right than the other. But when it comes to justice, Israel is the rich man and Palestine is the poor man. For a century, Israel has been taking away the little ewe lamb that sits at the Palestinian family's table. There has to be a political resolution for that before we can figure out a way to peace. The other important thing about this story about David and Uriah and Bathsheba and Nathan is that the frail, sickly baby that was conceived while Bathsheba was still Uriah's wife dies. And the biblical text implies that this is God's justice to punish David through the death of this child. After a period of mourning, David finally thinks it might be appropriate to go and comfort Bathsheba. And he courts her and wins her over, and they conceive a second child, and that child is Solomon, who becomes David's heir. The horrifying thing is that both justice and mercy look kind of bad in this story. The death of the child as justice seems incredibly unjust to the child. The birth of Solomon as God's mercy is still not a restoration of Uriah. I think this is one of those cases in which we have to say that God does not require suffering in order to bring good things, but God looks at horrible suffering and somehow winds up with Solomon. I think in addition to our prayers for peace, we have something of an obligation as a peaceful people to push our own government to find justice for the Middle East. And when that seems absolutely hopeless, as it so often does, to remember that somehow, and God alone knows how, God created the wisdom of Solomon out of the tribulation of Bathsheba.